Today I'm in Derby Velodrome, where I've come to talk to Simon Smart, who's one of the leading aerodynamicists and engineers in cycling, having previously worked for the Red Bull Formula One team. And he really is an incredibly knowledgeable guy when it comes to aerodynamics, having worked and developed things like bikes, frames, clothing, and also wheels as well. So I was really interested to ask him lots of questions. Firstly, just to give a bit of background to people watching, to you, like, why the transition from Formula One and motorsport to cycling?
Good question. I mean, at the time I was, I suppose, after doing Formula One for such a long time, I was getting a bit bored of it. It became very process-driven, and I was loving riding my bike and tyre trialling and wondering all the time about aerodynamics. And this was back in the mid-2000s, when there wasn't really any services in the UK for addressing, improving aero in cycling. And so yeah, I sort of started to experiment myself with positions and stuff, and found them some big differences, and it really went from there. And I realised I could make a business out of that. So we started in parallel Drag to Zero, where we were developing rider positions, and at the same time I started developing products. So then the two have sort of worked really well together, because I think it's really important to work with the athletes on a first-hand basis to really understand what they need and to get some idea for future products. And that's helped me develop wheels, clothing, frames over the years. So it was a good move. I didn't think I sort of kind of lucked in a bit at the time. I didn't really see what I was doing, but yeah, it's worked really well. And it's been amazing to see how the drag coefficients of the riders has changed. I mean, when we first started out, it wasn't unusual to get a time trialist with a CDA, a sort of high, 0.2, 0.26, 0.27, for someone who's actually taking it serious and racing. And yet today you often we can set up someone on an Aero road bike now, and they're down at 0.25, 0.26. So, and indeed, some of our time trialists people we get in the wind tunnel now can be down at 0.16. So it's really moved on, and everything's evolved. And I think the whole synergy's come together now with 10 years of positions and people working on their positions, and also the products of it really is a process of evolution. That the helmets and the skin suits and the positions are all kind of keying together to give you this overall system. Can
you tell us more about the sort of development process that went into the new skin suits and clothing?
Absolutely. I mean, the key part of this was developing a fabric that works across a range of speeds. So just going back to the fundamentals, if you take a cylinder, typically a smooth cylinder, the drag is constant throughout for any speed. And that's an assumption pretty much that you learn in engineering school. You can always assume that you get the same drag at any speed. So traditionally with testing, we've always you test at one speed, and then you can do a calculation and work out what the drag is then at another speed. So i.e. you take an object, stick it in the wind tunnel, measure the drag force, and from that you can then compute what the force would be if you're riding at 20 or 50 mile an hour. But there is an issue with that, and it's to do with texturing the surface in the transitional zone, whereby we can actually fall the flow into staying attached around the bluff body and reduce the pressure behind the body, and that's very important. So what happens is that on a cylinder you can have profound effects. If you test a cylinder in a tunnel on its own, you can actually reduce the drag over a small window of speed by around 50%. If you texture it in the correct way.
And your forearm, when you're on the bike, is basically a cylinder, isn't
exactly, it? Exactly, yeah. So what we call bluff bodies, where
your upper arm, sorry, not your forearm.
Yeah, I mean your legs, your arms, and when you're in a more upright position, also your trunk. Anything that is more like an elliptical shape rather than an aerofoil shape. So it's got a low aspect ratio in width to depth. It causes, basically, there isn't enough distance for the flow to stay attached around the shape, and that's where you get flow separation. So without getting too technical, one of the big sort of breakthroughs was we've looked at this for a long time. We've been developing suits for around 10 years, and we used to play a lot with trips and seams, which can be very effective at dropping that drag by 50% on a bluff body. But the challenge is that the position of that has to be really, really specific. So you can do an experiment in a wind tunnel and play with the position to get it just right and go, well, we've reduced the drag by 50%.
So that's the famous trip strips that you hear about being positioned on
exactly,
riders
on
and stuff.
arms and and legs and things. So, and they're great, but they are literally on a knife edge, because if they're not in quite the right position on you when you ride, or if the wind angle changes, then they need to be a slightly different configuration. And indeed, if the speed changes, they need to be a different configuration. So that's always been a big challenge for me. We've been aware of this, where we've got this sort of trick where you can reduce the drag of something with a trip or with texturing, which is a very established and known sort of engineering phenomenon. And so the challenge with Enduro was I sort of identified, I had some ideas on, we tested a lot of fabrics initially, and we came back to the same problem. You could have a fabric that performed really well at low speed or high speed. And indeed, we used it, and that correlated with garments we tested in the wind tunnel, and also ones we got experience from in the outside world, where we would define in the wind tunnel, for example, a suit that was really good for someone, and they'd go and do a race somewhere else, and they were slower, and you're like, well, what's wrong, the wind tunnel or what? And then you start to realise that speed actually has quite an effect on the CDA of the cyclist, and that all came down to looking at textures and trip edges. So we then embarked on the project with Endura, and I sort of thought it should be possible to widen and stabilise that situation, so that what we were looking for was a condition where we can try to produce a garment as much as possible, where we can rely on it having that 50% drag reduction through the full speed range. So that was really the key to the project, and the silicon technology that we're presenting today.
With regards to the helmet, like, is the testing process been the same as with the skin suit in terms of, like, I mean, it's smoother surface, so I'd imagine there's probably more CFD in there, and then
absolutely, absolutely right. Yeah, we haven't because it has a. We were talking about bluff bodies earlier. It's got the aim of it. It's got a tail, and it's so it doesn't need the texturing. You wouldn't get an advantage. So and it's not speed sensitive as such. The key things were, the key findings were the wider tail. We were finding a lot of other helmets on the market with the
pointy tail.
The flow's trying to do too much. It's sort of expanding over the top and around at the sides at the same time, so that can have an effect straight ahead and in yaw. So we got some gain from that, and also so the tail works quite nicely with cooling, so that the helmet. It was the key things for the helmet. I've had a lot of experience over the years of testing other people's helmets and advising riders on what helmets they should use. And it is quite tempting to get carried away in a wind tunnel or a fixed position and getting a really low head, and you ask them to look down the wind tunnel, but can they really see far enough that they can react to bumps and things coming up when you're doing 50 kph? So the key things for us were ventilation, cooling, fit, and aerodynamics, and we're really pretty pleased we ticked all the boxes really. So we work really. One of the key problems with a lot of helmets is that you get them in a position that works well with the tail touching the back, but then you can't. You have to look up all the time because the crash section is too close to your eyebrows.
Yeah.
So this helmet, you'll notice, it's been designed, and it was quite hard to pass the. The Cora did a great job with the structure to be able to have a slightly higher, lower line to the helmet, and therefore a bigger visor, which means you can get your head lower and see properly.
Yeah, a big sort of popular thing that people talk about is sort of lightweight products, lightweight bikes versus sort of aero bikes. Now there's typically around sort of 200 to 300 grams difference usually between the lightweight frame and the aero frame from the same sort of brand.
Okay. Yeah.
This is a big question, right? If someone was doing an event and they're not a pro and they're doing an event like a Le Mans or a Gran Fondo, which do you think is the superior equipment choice if they have a choice between the two?
It has to. There's been the early Aero road bikes were too far, too aero, and there's too much of a compromise with weight and stiffness. But I think the latest generation of bikes is spot on. I would definitely go with the aero choice.
And have you done any sort of analysis of modelling of courses, or done any maths to look at the trade-off between the saving made typically from an aero road setup versus the sort of slight weight saving that you'd get from a climbing setup?
it's not. I mean, I think the difficulty is you got to consider the stiffness of the bike as well. But yeah, I mean, I remember when we developed the Scott foil back in sort of 2012. The aim was to make it as aero as possible, but make the bike suitable that it would be ridden on every stage of the Tour de France.
Yeah.
Because before then, aero bikes had only been ridden on the odd stage because they were deemed to be too heavy over any other stages.
And not comfortable and stuff.
Exactly,
as well,
yeah. So it's a challenge, I think, with these products to tick all the boxes. But yeah, generally speaking, unless you're just doing a hilltop finish, then I think above about sort of a 6 or 7% gradient, then aerodynamics is always sort of significant.
Yeah. So something that, just changing the subject slightly, I was interested. There's sort of an urban myth goes around, and Mark Cavendish, I've heard Mark Cavendish say before that Kittel gets a bigger advantage from wearing a skin suit than him because he's bigger and there's more of him. What's your take on that? Is that true or is that drivel?
No, absolutely. That makes perfect sense. And depending on their position, like when they're sprinting, if he's wide-shouldered and Mark's very, very tucked in, then you can't make a gain twice. Mark's got an amazing position aero-wise when he's sprinting, so he's reduced his drag, and that's one of the reasons why he's been successful. You can't then go and really reduce that again that much, maybe a little bit. So that's absolutely right. Someone very wide with these big bluff bodies is you're going to have a bigger advantage from the latest skin suits with a texture in than someone that's got their arms hidden.
Right.
So
that is yeah. The aerodynamic experts.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. Cheers, Simon.
You're welcome. Cheers.
I hope you enjoyed our chat with Simon Smart. I certainly found it incredibly interesting, and I sort of felt like I could have carried on chatting all afternoon. I had so many questions for him. But if you enjoyed this video, then why not subscribe to the Cycling Weekly channel and give it a thumbs up? And if you want to see more videos to do with cycling geekery, science and aerodynamics, then we'll post some links in the description below to our skin suits video and other aero testing videos. But until then, I'll see you next time.